I'd like to welcome people and to assure them that the Q&A afterwards is for everyone to participate in and ask any questions you like, because the goal of filmmaking for us is about helping people feel more comfortable around a subject that fills people with fear. And in our presentation last night with Catherine Mannix, she talked about that fear that she felt when she came to see our film. Now, she's an expert in communication and listening, but you know, the death of a child is people's worst nightmare, and we don't want bereaved parents to be isolated, or siblings, bereaved siblings. So enjoy the film, and I use that word lightly. We hope it fills you with hope and that it is something that's helpful for you. But whatever your experience, do join us afterwards for the Q&A. We really look forward to it. Over to you, Cassandra, and thanks to everyone at Lifting the Lid for inviting us.
As a society, I think we are very bad at talking about death.
So do you think more people are thinking about something they wouldn't allow themselves to think about before?
I think it is a wake-up call for our society to think about death. Like Sagar's death was a big reminder to me of my own mortality.
My name is Jane Harris, and this is my husband, Jimmy Edmonds. Our son Joshua died in 2011, and over the past decade we've been trying to make sense of this very personal tragedy, and we've been learning how to handle the pain of our grief as we adapt to a life without him. Now, the COVID pandemic has brought many of these earlier feelings back to the surface.
It brings us face to face with that kind of uncertainty, that the unknown and the unpredictable can kind of come upon you at any time.
That's the battle and the conversations I'm constantly having in my head is me dying, you know, myself dying, leaving my children to experience what I had to endure as a 12-year-old boy and my sister.
In a new series of lockdown conversations, I want to discover how other bereaved people are managing their grief during this epidemic.
You know, initially I was just like, okay, this makes sense to me, the world stopping. I wasn't afraid of it. You know, there was a part of me that embraced it. Now all I can do is think about my grief. There's no other distraction.
Yeah, being just locked in with yourself, really being aware of how alone I am, because I did a very good job of kind of masking that with endless sociability. And then, yeah, you just sort of go back there again, the disbelief of how can he not be here? It just makes no sense. How can somebody be here one day and then not here the next?
As we all come to terms with the deep trauma that has gripped our society, I want to know, how are we managing this new normal?
Is talking to your dead child outside people's norms? Yes, it is. But you know what? I have to live every day without my child. That is so far out of the norm that I can't even see norm in the rearview mirror.
Do you wear a mask to protect yourself, or do you wear a mask to protect other people?
How are we coping with the emotional chaos that the pandemic, like grief, has created? That growing sense of unease and loss of trust in the world.
COVID has brought out the worst in all of this, because we are making judgments based on resources, based on who's the fittest. I very much worry that there would be a judgment against my life as not worth living, even when it is for me.
I'll be talking with old friends and new.
For me, being in lockdown and in isolation actually isn't so bad. When Leisha died, the very worst thing happened to us, and this is so much easier than the worst thing that has happened to us. We've been isolated really for the last 4 years.
I've had space, my head has had space, I've had clarity. It sounds stupid to feel good when my husband's dead, but I do. I feel possibly the best that I've felt since Tony died. This period of time has allowed me to grieve and just be.
Please join me as I explore what our experiences of death, dying and bereavement can teach us about living in a post-COVID world.
One of the things that everybody is worried about is, what is the bereavement epidemic going to look like after this?
we've just had a beautiful comment about what a moving film, and the question, Mark is in the middle of answering a question about distance grieving, because of course we haven't been attending memorial services or funerals. So go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was going to say that, I didn't experience it myself, but I was extremely fortunate to be able to support my wife through losing her dad, not to COVID, but we were able to support her through that, and also support him, and that was when many people weren't able to do that. So I guess in terms of that question, I was the opposite, because he only lived down the road. But yeah, for lots of people, they had to tune into the funeral via Zoom and watch it online, and that's incredibly hard, isn't it? Those that can't get there and can't be there wherever they are in the world, and that lends itself to a whole new world of grief, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think it's been really, really interesting. I went to several virtual funerals during the last 18 months, none of which actually were deaths due to COVID, but all of which were lonely deaths because of COVID. And I think that one of the things that perhaps we need to ask ourselves is, what can we do that is about the ritual that is very, very important, ritual around the end of life. All civilizations, all walks of life have rituals because it helps us to make meaning, doesn't it?
Yes.
And somehow we feel disengaged when we're watching passively the ritual of somebody's funeral. And so perhaps we need to ask ourselves how the celebrants of those funerals can engage the virtual audience. Should we be being told beforehand to have ready a candle or a flower or a piece of nature, or an object that reminds us of the person whose life we're celebrating, his death we're marking, so that we can be more actively engaged in that celebration, even though we're not physically present? Because there's a sense of unreality unless we can find a way to bring ourselves into the presence of the real death of that person, isn't there? And people are still working through that months later because they haven't been able to be present at the death. And many of us are not present at the death of a person we've loved. But if to not be able to gather for the comfort of each other and for the funeral is a significant second loss.
That's very true, Catherine. Because one of the reasons we make films is to create meaning out of difficult stuff. And Josh died abroad. We didn't get to say goodbye. And it made us think really hard about everyone who is experiencing grief during COVID. Because, we discovered we had to create a ritual. We had to find a way to say goodbye, as we didn't get to say goodbye to our son. And in many ways, I think it's really important to take the pressure off people and say, you don't have to do it now. Rules don't help. They really don't. Whenever you find the way, the means, the energy, that's okay. But that extra pressure can just be so tough. And I know that, for us and our family and Josh's siblings, it meant the world to have a ritual, but the timing of that ritual wasn't the important part of it. It was having the opportunity to say goodbye, to make it real, to let it sink in. It's a death in the wrong order when you lose a child or when you lose a partner. It's back to front. And it's your worst nightmare. And so, you're traumatized, and trauma isn't unusual with these kind of deaths. And a lot of people have been deeply traumatized by COVID and all the deaths that they've had to go through, and right now everybody's grieving for something. We're living through extraordinary times. And we wanted to make a film that captured something of that, that would, if you like, bear witness and allow people to stand in the shoes of others, because we're all new to this, we're all learning, and we have to remain open and we have to listen really hard. And it's very uncomfortable. And as every bereaved parent knows, being a bereaved parent's the loneliest thing in the world, because you kind of represent people's worst nightmare. And so people steer away from you. And I think we've all got to gather together and be brave and be strong. And if you like, deal with our discomfort around this difficult stuff. Otherwise, we can't help each other. Really being still and calm and quiet. Less is more, really, in these difficult times.
This is John Woodhouse, and don't you've seen in the comments, is asking, you know, a good friend arrived too late for his mom's death, coming from New Zealand, how to comfort him. And that discomfort is what you're talking about. Like, I'm uncomfortable because he's uncomfortable. But John says, I gave him a big hug. Well, keep doing that. You know, being present, I think, is exactly as you say, being able to listen and ask your friend, how can I comfort you? You know, ask him. He's the one who needs comforting, and he has his own special way.
I mean, certainly at the Good Grief Project, you know, we've been asked to give talks to companies, to the police, to people working in the profession, in all sorts of professions, because we all want to help, but sometimes it's just not possible. You know, it can't be fixed. And when something can't be fixed, people are left feeling terribly inadequate. And we have to deal with our inadequacy, I think, to be able to be of any use to other people. So the first port of call is to attend to ourselves. We need to figure out how we can be robust enough to be alongside. And if we're not robust enough, I would say, I can't cope right now, but I just want you to know I'm there for you in the best way I can be. But really, you know, the most helpful thing people can do is be courageous. Because as a therapist, I regularly have clients who say, oh, it's 6 weeks and people are asking me if I've found closure. Am I over it? Am I better? And that's not because they mean any harm. It's because they are so horrified at the reality that their friend or sibling or partner is living through. And every one of us has to get braver. That's the biggest favor we can do right now to anyone that we really love, is to sit still and listen really hard, however uncomfortable we are, and keep breathing. And that helps.
It was an amazing moment in the film when it was clearly a long time after that couple's little daughter had died that she shaved her hair off, and her face lit up. And this goes back to that ritual of whenever you're ready.
That's right.
Do that. And it clearly helped her.
It helped her find her voice. It helped her find meaning. And she felt that she was doing something constructive to honor her daughter. And I think that's a really big step. And, you know, whether it's 1 year or, I mean, it's 10 years since our son died. And, you know, we still are surprised by how we grieve. We learn all the time from what our son has taught us. And I think that Deirdre in the film, her reality was that when we first met her, she didn't want to talk about it. But the more she talked about it and the more she let other people who understood bear witness, the more able she was to allow something to shift within her and to realize that actually she could carry her daughter with her in her heart, as I carry my son, as we all carry our loved ones. But that doesn't just happen. It's something that isn't magic, but it is hard work. And we want to do that, don't we? You know, I'm not going to stop loving my son because he's dead.
Right.
So the word closure for me is always the dirty C word. I find openings, I find new ways of carrying my boy with me. He teaches me stuff every day. Today I went swimming in the sea. It was freezing cold. Josh was right there with me, laughing and going, Mom, I can't believe you. I can't believe you're doing this. And the reason I was doing it was because I really wanted to kind of give myself a shake and find some new energy, because I was feeling a bit exhausted by, you know, all sorts of things, as we are all feeling right now during COVID. So I guess being open to whatever it is that we're feeling is helpful, because the grief can be a bit of a monster. It will out, whether you like it or not, physically or emotionally. It will find its way out. So you may as well embrace it if you can. And if you can't, then just find the right support, whether that be peer support or therapy. You know, people who've been bereaved through COVID, you know, it's unspeakable, the loneliness of it all. And the injustice, I think, for a lot of people. you know, and as Catherine says, in Black Lives Matter, and what we've gone through with racism, particularly today, right now, this week, the injustice, the horror of the unfairness of what's happening in America right now and in the UK. It's not okay, but it's not separate from what's going on with COVID, where, you know, we have to help each other now. We have to work, don't we? And I think, Catherine, you've got a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I think there's something very important about us understanding that there are a lot of things that can't be fixed, isn't there? And that because we want to help, we mistake fixing for the help, when actually just turning up is the help. And sitting there and letting somebody that we love sit with their pain, express their pain, explore their pain. It is very, very painful to sit beside somebody in distress. And yet okay, come on, why don't we think about something more cheerful? Or, oh, let's think about some of the funny times because we're just doing all the sad stuff at the moment. Or let's just have a cup of tea. That's really...
Sorry, guys, can you hear me at all?
Yes. Can't see you, Mark.
Yeah, we can't see Mark. We can hear you.
That's really...
Yeah, sorry, I've got really poor internet connection here. But I'll sit and listen. But if when they cut out, it's just the internet's not great.
Sorry, you're right there in the room.
Because there's a question I want to ask you, but Catherine, if you don't say anything, we'll move on. But first, Catherine, you were in the middle of saying.
So the temptation to try to reduce somebody's distress by reducing them talking about their distress or sitting with their distress is capable of being misconstrued as I am not okay that you are so distressed. So let's move on now. And that's about me. So the act of very deliberate companionship in distress is a choice we have to make. And being able to ask a person, as you said before, Alison, what can I do now that will be helpful? And just to be listened to and not be talked across or persuaded to cheer up or get distracted. Of course, all those things are important too, because you can't function if your whole day, your whole week, your whole month is in that terrible place. But it's a huge compliment to somebody for a person to actually be able to be in that place with you. Take it as the compliment that it is, and just get out of your own way and be their companion.
Be there because it shows that you actually want to be there. A lot of people will avoid somebody who's bereaved, and showing that you want to be there, not being. I'm interested, Mark, can you hear me? Are you okay on the internet now? Yes. Okay,
yeah,
we got you.
I can hear you, yeah. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear anything Catherine said, but I can hear you.
Okay. Let's try just briefly then. You something that you said in the film really struck me, which was when your father died and you were 12, your world came to an end, but you began to build a new one. And were you aware of that at the time, or is that in retrospect? Who was listening to you at that point?
Yeah, I think it was only, like Jane was saying, it takes work and it takes time to understand, the process. And for me, I think it was through my teenage years that I really started to understand that I had changed as a person forever. I was a different individual. I was a different boy, turning into a man, and that took a while to us to. It was a strange feeling, a strange sensation that all of a sudden, there's this huge shift in your life, not just because you've lost a parent, your role model, but because your outlook as well has just changed, massively. And I think that's why now, 29 years, I'm quite passionate about talk about, and people know that it's all wrong with who have changed a person. And because I think a lot of time people struggle to understand that and it's a difficult concept, isn't it, to get used to, that, you know, that you've changed as a person, as that. So yeah, I think that's what I meant. Yeah.
Absolutely. And your somebody was talking about how your whole identity has changed. Often a lot of people's whole identity has changed during COVID because they've lost their job or somebody has died, etc. That's what you were dealing with a lot earlier than so many of us have at this point. I was very aware of becoming an adult orphan. And it was really helpful for me to hear what you were saying in the film about how COVID returned us to our grief, actually, and that I had been on antidepressants during the dying of my mother and my aunt in 2019. And as we came into spring, we came into March 2020, and I was thinking, I feel a lot better now. And my daughter was about to visit, and I went off them. And then she had to cancel her trip, and everything went dark again. And I'm, back on them because I was crying every day again. And it wasn't doable. It wasn't doable. It wasn't at that point, it wasn't a question of just sitting with it. I couldn't function. And now it gave myself a little bit of breathing space to start again in a way. But having support and the ability to do that is great. Otherwise, it's just chaos, isn't it?
It is. You do need that support network, and if you're lucky enough to have a support network around you, that you can call upon. But also, again, going back to what Jane was saying, having the courage to accept that support, and that you have to work on how you're feeling. It's not an easy road, but you will get there. I like the fact that. Sorry, Jane.
I was going to say it's so important as well for our sibling, our children, if you like, if they've lost a sibling, because siblings are so often the forgotten mourners. They lose a parent as well as a sibling when someone dies, and I think that as parents we have to be able to be in touch with our grief. Otherwise, we're not giving our kids permission to grieve, and our instinct is to protect our children. You've already kind of failed because your child has died. Every parent feels they've failed if they can't protect their child. And of course, that's illogical. What happened to Josh would have happened to Josh. It wasn't because of me, but it's instinct, isn't it, when things happen in the wrong order. So, listening to our kids, finding safe, neutral space for ourselves is terribly important so that we can actually open up and be honest and true about what we're really experiencing rather than masking it. Because these deaths happen to us. And as Sangeeta said in the film, her son's suicide was something that she was left to work with.
Right.
And that's really interesting because the silence of suicide is appalling. The shame, the language, commit suicide. I don't think there's a week that goes by that I don't have to say to someone, I just want to point out to you that it's not great to say commit suicide, and explain to them in a way they don't feel put down or horrified or apologetic. And people absorb it. They really do want to know. But I think in the heat of the moment, people come out with cliches. People say the most dreadful things like, my GP said to me, my ex-GP, as it happens, said to me, everything happens for a reason. After my son had died, and now she was not meaning to harm me, but she was so uncomfortable and clearly was terrified, probably. I think it was in the transference, probably. As a therapist, I can rationalize it. But at the time I screamed to her, I'm Jewish. Do you think the Holocaust happened for a reason?
Yes.
And she looked pale, upset, and I said, I'm sorry, I don't want to be angry with you. I'm just angry. I'm angry that my son has died and you can't help me. And I'm not blaming you. So I think it's back to what Catherine was saying. We have to square up. And Catherine wrote about coming to see our film that's going to be screened tomorrow, A Love That Never Dies. And Catherine, I don't know if you want to share the story of that a little bit, but I know you didn't really want to be in the room, but you stayed in the room, and you've been such a comfort because you stayed in the room. And this is how we help people. We get out of our comfort zones. I'd love you to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I'm glad to, because it's such a learning experience for me. I'd written a book about dying, and as a consequence, you start to meet people who work in that area, and Jane and Jimmy were people who got in touch because their film A Love That Never Dies, they were taking the opportunity to find cinema showings, and they were trying to have audience discussions afterwards. And so, oh, here's somebody who talks about dying and death. Maybe she'll help by hosting one of the cinema discussions. Are you crazy? Bereaved parents? No, I can sit beside somebody who's dying, even a child who's dying, and find useful things to do. I understand that territory. I know how to be present at a deathbed and enable people to understand what's happening in order that when they do move into their bereavement, they haven't mistaken what they've seen and heard, become traumatized unnecessarily by those mistakes about the breathing sounds as though the person's drowning, maybe, or they're breathing through their voice and so it sounds like they're groaning, when in fact they're deeply unconscious. So I can see a really important role with things to do, tasks to fiddle with, if you like, around a deathbed. But grieving people, I got nothing. And at that point, I don't think I realised that that's how it is. So here are these people asking me if I will accompany people watching their film. They were very kind. They sent me the film so I could watch it privately. It took me a week in divided doses even to watch the film. It was too terrible to bear. It's a wonderful film, but the losses in it were too terrible. And then eventually we ended up at the same arts festival, didn't we, in Cheltenham? So we met, which was wonderful, and they said, "Oh, great, walk to the cinema with us." So, and it was immediately after my event, which had been very well attended because I was accompanied by the lovely Greg Wise. So it was a big audience because Greg draws a big audience. So, and of course, it was the same audience in the cinema. So people say, "Oh, hi, Catherine, like to talk." So there was nowhere to hide. And I just kind of cowered. I put my scarf over my head because I thought, I don't know how to be here. And what happened was extraordinary, was that because I watched it now, family after family after family bearing witness, telling their story, naming their children's names, talking about their significance, talking about their continuing bonds, talking about the transformation of life. And the alternative would be that that child had never been, so that they would not have died. And that would be worse than this loss. And when I dared to open my eyes, I could see that even though I was kind of leaning back and holding myself, everybody else is leaning forwards and they're nodding and they're saying, "Yes, yes, yes, this is how it is, yes." I said, oh my goodness, there is nothing to do. And that's the whole point.
Right.
To be there and have nothing but yourself and your attention is the task. And I'd been doing that all along because I didn't know what else to do. But it turns out that is the right thing to do. And I'd always felt like because I wasn't doing something helpful, I wasn't helping. So I've done that transformational journey. And I couldn't speak. By the end of the film, I just couldn't speak. But it's been so helpful for me to go to a place where that repeated, almost that litany of repeated, very similar experiences enabled me to see the pattern that I'd seen forever, but hadn't previously recognised and understood. Utterly transformational.
And Catherine, don't you think that the remarkable thing about this is that health professionals are not trained how to deal with this? I mean, obviously things are changing now, but I mean, it's not an integral part of the training, or it wasn't. And that idea of being alongside and being helpless is the thing that we all dread. We're all ready to fix and we're all ready to mend. But when something can't be fixed or mended, we have to really steel ourselves and say, okay, I'm going to have to get my big girl pants on here. I'm going to have to just accept this is what it is. And I think that's what we're living through now with the huge numbers of deaths. The reason we've made this film Beyond the Mask is in the title of the film. We can all go out there and be high performance mask wearers, you know, and we can, you know, we wear our masks to protect other people as much as ourselves. But really, bottom line is we need to get stronger and braver. And festivals and events like this are all about that. None of us like to share our private stories, but we do it for a reason. And so I would like to just thank Catherine and Mark and Alison and Joe and everyone at the Lifting the Lid Festival for, you know, having the courage to do this, because it does take courage, doesn't it?
It does. And it's been very interesting hearing from there, particularly one or two of our Asian attendees and presenters talking about more reserved cultures that where being less outstanding in verbally is a value, is a, you know, being quiet is a value. Being amiable and not rocking the boat is really a strong value. And also in the Japanese tradition, and when I lived in Singapore for a long time, it's very, very clear how a funeral is supposed to go. And in Japan, there's something that you must say rather than anything you feel otherwise want to say, that kind of thing. And so discussion among the people asking questions about this, how it's, yes, yeah, I agree. Like we trying to be stronger and braver is really important, but I don't want people to imagine that what you're saying is we need to be louder. It's we need to be brave enough to be quiet and present. And that I think is really interesting. People are always saying, I don't know what to say. And I just don't understand that. It's ask, you know, ask. So I think that's really wonderful. Hey, Catherine, I have an idea. This seems to be a big subject with you. Why don't you write a book called Listen? Would that be a good idea?
It is astonishing the reception the book has had. It's been really lovely. But it's from two lots of people, really, the people who already are the listeners and who understand the beauty of being listened to, but also from people whose professional role often includes listening, and yet who also feel that because it's a professional role, it has to include fixing. Right. And to be given the permission to see the listening as part of the fixing, I think has been a really interesting thing.
Yeah. As a bomb. One of the things that you say on your website is my weapon of choice for this campaign is stories. And this is, I mean, what we have here is three storytellers. Mark, you have your podcast, you have your children's books, and you're a filmmaker and you are writing and speaking a lot. And so these are things that you can, we are listening to you in an effort to learn how to listen. We are watching you listen. In that film, we watched you listen. That was a tremendous amount of listening that we watched you do. And you have the most beautiful eyes. And it was wonderful to watch them take in the story, you know, that I'm sure made the way you listen made people very comfortable.
I think that the learning that I have internalized is because of post-traumatic growth. I hate to use the term, but it's not really as complicated as it sounds, you know. My Josh, in his short 22 years, has taught me so much, but so have all my clients. And the most important part of being a therapist is the part of the training that really matters is the most difficult part, which is sitting with the most uncomfortable feelings silently. And when I combine that with the learning that I have had through my bereavement, my dad with dementia and my mom, you know, and lots of losses in my life, it's taught me so much, and it's given me the strength, and I think it's given me the courage. I'm not always courageous, but it's given me the courage in the here and now to just, I suppose, appreciate the importance of every day. And that's what death teaches you. I think that's what trauma teaches you, as Mark and Catherine will know, that when you go through difficult stuff like Mark did with his dad, and, Catherine bears witness to all sorts of things, you actually know that you've just got to absorb it as best you can, as quietly as you can.
Mm-hmm.
You build a certain empathy. So I was going to say empathy for people, and you can't you have an understanding of how you might like to be listened to, by others. And I think that's what I've learned along the way is how to listen to others, because that's what I've always wanted myself,
Yes.
And so you sort of, I picked these things up along the way, and then eventually, I never thought I would be sitting there doing a podcast talking about this subject, but the incredible feeling of being able to go and listen and talk to somebody else about their own experience is so powerful.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And for those who don't know, it's called Grief Is My Superpower. How did you come to that title?
Yeah, but it's an interesting one, because I know for a lot of people, they hear that title and like, how is it your superpower? This awful thing has happened to me and all that. And I basically, because I've gone through this traumatic, horrendous thing, and I came out the other side. I'm not saying I'm healed. I'm not saying I'm fixed, but I'm living with it, and I've learned how to live with it and wear it. And so for me, over time, it's become my superpower, because I've harnessed that thing that's forward, and and all of these sort of facets of me and who I am now is because of that traumatic event, and that's kind of, don't get me wrong, it took me a little while to get there, but that's what it kind of dawned on me one day, is grief is my superpower. Grief has taught me so much, like James said. And so I thought, wow, that could be an interesting title for a podcast. So
it's a really great title. And the film that we're showing at the festival tomorrow, Love That Never Dies, the clue's in the title of the film, actually. A Love That Never Dies, because your dad will always be your dad, Mark, and you I guess have learned, as I have learned, to remember how your dad lived, how my son lived, as much as how they died. Their death, of course, is huge, but actually we have to remember how people live. And I think right now, during this pandemic, through COVID, which is no way over, we're having to really hang on to this reality of remembering how people live their lives, and how do we honor them, and what do we do that matters and can make a difference. And I hear that in what you're saying, Mark, and in what you're learning, Catherine, all the time, working with the patients and the groups that you work with. Death needs to be addressed in a much more comfortable way. Otherwise, we end up in a terrible mess with families who are fractured, and people who are hurting, and people who are fighting, and with nowhere to go and no one to listen to them. And that's not okay, is it? It's just not okay.
Catherine, do you know if we have another, if for example we have another lockdown, or if there's a huge surge, are families going to be allowed this time around to visit COVID patients in the hospital?
I think it's really hard to know. I think if there is another surge, then we have to be able to protect the staff in the hospital, so that these patients who are currently being looked after aren't the last ones who can be looked after, because there are no staff left to look after the next lot.
Exactly.
So it is a terrible, terrible decision for strategic level managers to make. And it is a terrible, terrible burden for the staff who are at the sides of those dying people when their families aren't allowed to be with them, because they know that they're not the right person, and they know that this is completely heartbreaking for them. And when I went back to work during COVID, what I was doing was staff support and kind of communication skills training and support for those really, really heartbreaking, unwelcome news conversations that staff were needing to make by phone.
Right.
But the commonest thing that I heard was the heartbreak of realizing that this is the last face this person's going to see. It's got a mask on. It's not the person that they love. but also the transformation of staff understanding of end-of-life care, because people who haven't traditionally looked after dying people were now at the bedsides of dying people. They were having to help them have conversations with their families because the piped oxygen makes a lot of noise.
Right.
And if your oxygen levels aren't terribly high in your brain, you can be a little bit muddled. It's hard to hear, it's hard to make sense. So those usually deeply private conversations become a conversation that's being relayed via a healthcare professional. Your dad wants to tell you that he's thinking of you and that he loves you. Oh, she says she loves you. Dad, thanks for being an absolutely fantastic dad.
Oh.
That's so poignant. But wow, what an education in being present and not getting in the way, because you're the conduit for these absolutely essential farewell conversations.
I want to protect your time, and there are other sessions, etc., etc. So I will ask you if there's something that you want to say that we haven't said yet.
I think we've touched upon the things that have been the things that I've witnessed and learned during COVID. I think that's been really useful. Thanks, Alison.
Mm-hmm. And the last word should be yours, Jane.
Well,
thank you so much for this film. I want to hear some more, but
absolutely. And I think it is time to wind it up. And I'd like to really thank everyone for joining. I suppose what I would say is that I think we should all be aware of pecking orders of grief and hierarchies of grief, and recognize that grief takes many forms, and anticipatory grief is a very neglected area. And we need to be aware of that. And I think never make assumptions about the levels of grieving that people are going through, because I mean, I'm a bereaved parent. People think that, that's the worst it gets. Well, I'm not saying it isn't. But what I am saying is it creates a lonely world if people think other people's grief is worse.
Right.
It means you become so lonely, and I've been there, and so isolated because nobody will speak to you. I mean, I've seen people cross the road. I've made a film called Say Their Name about people crossing the road for the wonderful Compassionate Friends. So I'd say just be so aware that everybody does it their own way, and that there is no rules that really help, except that we all do it differently. Myself and Jimmy grieve differently. My children grieve for their brother very differently to me. They think my grief is worse than theirs. I don't agree. Do you know? And so I don't like people to be robbed of their grief. I want everyone to have the opportunity. And so I would end on that note. Just be mindful that the person who lives next door to you could be nursing a broken heart.
Yes.
And it might be because, their husband died 30 years ago at age 90. I know back to front, and child grief is different, but I'm just saying there's a lot of very sad, broken-hearted, grieving people around. And everyone right now is grieving for something. And the world is a complicated, anxious place for a lot of us.
Exactly.
Thank you. And thanks to Mark and to Catherine for joining, and to Alison for hosting so generously.
Wonderful to meet you all.
Thank you so much.
Take a step back and do some more listening. Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.